Okay, so I think this is pretty much where we left off last class, which is where we're really just starting to talk about Freud. So we spent a lot of time talking about how Marcuse's argument sort of fits into contemporary society. The argument that he advances here in this book, Eros and Civilization, written in the 1950s, is still relevant to a large extent. But Marcuse also kind of changed course a little bit in the 1960s, and we spent a lot of time talking about that last class. So again, the argument that he advances here is that people are repressed, but that repression really doesn't serve any kind of moral purpose. It basically serves the purpose of producing profit. The people, are simply forced to repress themselves in order to, be more productive workers for the most part. So I think that's pretty much true. You still see this, I think, to a large extent today. I think it's mostly concentrated among what we would, in this country at least, refer to as the Christian right, or religious right, maybe more generally speaking. And that since the 1960s, you've seen a move away somewhat from the kind of more repressed morality of the 1950s. I think most people kind of have that picture or that impression of basically, culture in 1950s America. And then since the 1960s, things have become a little more, open. Although Marcuse then introduces this idea, what he calls repressive desublimation, which is that even the sort of gradual opening and fulfillment of sexual and aggressive impulses are sort of fostered to the extent to which they can also be used to basically control people, to the extent in which people's needs, their instinctual needs, are basically gratified to some limited extent, at least under the present day social system, that it sort of resigns it resigns them to the status quo, right? So it's a means of basically fostering conformity and complacence among the population. As I suggested somewhat, sarcastically, again, people will put up with the lack of true freedom, the lack of basic human rights, as long as they get to see, boobs on television and drive, a big, noisy, aggressive car, which is, of course, just one way in which you can, explain that process. But I'm trying to get into the spirit of Marcuse, right? Who really tends to make you feel that people are kind of pathetic. So I'm trying to sort of invoke that spirit here, and again, perhaps too much so. I mean, I think Marcuse is a little too pessimistic about people, and maybe I should emphasize that more. Also, maybe I didn't as much last class, but not everybody is like that either. Some people are. I would find it very hard to argue that significant portion of the population aren't like that, but maybe not the majority, and certainly not everybody. But Marcuse does kind of really make you feel that way about people. He tends to really make you feel like people are kind of pathetic, and I think maybe that's not entirely surprising or a coincidence then, that many people who were students of his or followers of his to some extent later did take up violence. I mean, if you look at the political movements, of the late 1960s going into the 1970s, there was a significant increase in political violence. People like Angela Davis, the Black Power movement was violent in many aspects, certainly more so than what Martin Luther King had in mind, and even probably what Malcolm X had in mind, who may have said things like, by any means necessary, implying the use of violence to achieve political goals. But it wasn't like he was out there like bombing buildings or anything like that, government buildings and stuff. There was another group known as the Weather Underground. Has anyone ever heard of this before, or heard of this group, whose members were known as the Weathermen? And these were also college students, mostly white, upper middle class, highly educated college students who sort of came out of the peaceful, nonviolent anti-war movement, and by the 1970s has sort of moved into political terrorism, and throughout the decade basically bombed several government buildings. Now, amazingly enough, never actually killed anybody. I mean, their MO, their modus operandi was to plant bombs in government buildings, but then notify people of it so that the buildings would be evacuated and no one actually got killed. So, maybe not the most ruthless, violent act imaginable, but they were still, they were setting off bombs in buildings. And were active basically. I had always thought of them as like a 1970s thing, but actually, in various offshoots of that original group, basically were active through the 1980s. So I had a pretty long history of doing things like that. And again, many of these people, if they were not directly students of Marcuse himself, were very much sort of, reading his books and sort of, following in this way of thinking. So there is something to be said for that. Maybe Marcuse does overstate the argument a little bit that people were the vast majority of people, again, including, most of the working class, were essentially bought off by the system. They'd essentially become corrupted by the system, corrupted by the easy consumer pleasures of life, the limited gratification of their sexual and aggressive impulses that they were able to obtain under the present day society, and had basically made them, essentially part of the enemy. And so I think there is, some caution there in sort of following these ideas too much so. That being said, I would think, like I said, it'd be hard to argue that I think Marcuse was totally wrong either. I think maybe he just sort of, exaggerates the case a little bit. And for that matter, again, the kind of 1960s and 1950s, post-war prosperity that many Americans enjoyed, although not everybody, obviously, has worn off to a significant amount, right? And this idea of the so-called affluent society that he's talking about, doesn't really exist anymore. Or if it does, it's become increasingly a sort of for a significantly smaller strata of the population than probably existed during the 1960s. What else can be said for that? So that idea, is kind of a change of pace from, again, what he's talking about in the 1950s. This sort of, throwback to a more overt repression of instincts, particularly of the sexual instincts. Like I said, is much more characteristic of the religious right. However, then I started thinking after class, I think both tendencies do kind of exist to a certain extent. After the 1980s, there really was sort of a return to conservative values in many regards. And I don't know exactly where we are at today. Clearly we haven't gone back to how things were in the 1950s, not entirely at least. And if there was sort of a return to conservative values in the 1980s, maybe that has kind of worn off as well. Then you talk about, modern day debates over culture and censorship. So I'm kind of curious to see what other people think in this class. How would you sort of rate the level of censorship and repression that goes on in society today? Do you think that we live in a very repressed society, that people are not, that people are, again, forced to repress their instinctual, aspects of themselves, particularly, regarding sexuality, aggression, things like that? Or do we give relatively free reign to those things? With some limitations, obviously. Yes, what do we have here in the chat? So I think it just depends on where you live. Yeah, I think that is true, right? And certainly in the more so-called red state, blue state thing, you probably see that a lot more in the red states. The states where you have, one abortion clinic in the whole state, where, they tried to rewrite the Constitution at some point to define, marriages between a man and a woman. Many of those states, these so-called red states, and I think this is often overlooked by people, are also the same states that are very, are probably the most anti-working class states as well. These are the states where it's hardest to organize a union, where workers, generally receive the lowest wages, where unemployment benefits are the lowest, where generally speaking, the sort of, balance of power between employers and between employers and employees are generally sort of most skewed in favor of the employer. Not to say that states like New York and New Jersey are great in those areas. They certainly are not, but I think the so-called, red states are generally worse in most of those areas. And again, I think that's something that often gets overlooked, that these very conservative states are oftentimes the most anti-working class states as well, which again kind of goes along with Marcuse's argument, right? Which is that the states that are, or that where you see the most amount of repression, that this repression doesn't really serve any moral purpose other than producing profits, other than being a productive employee. And I think that's a very sort of, effective criticism of the religious right here in this country, because it really sort of cuts through their whole moral hypocrisy, right? There's all this self-righteous, holier than thou stuff. I mean, and there of course their views on abortion, same-sex marriage, sex, outside of procreation. I mean, I just the other day heard a story that Republicans are launching yet another push to like ban birth control and things like that. Like, I mean, they don't even think that people should be having sex unless they're having children or trying to have children. And it really shows you that all this moral hand wringing and all this self-righteous stuff, it doesn't really serve any real purpose other than just to make people more productive employees, to produce more profit, basically. So I think that very much sort of cuts through that pretense there. And I think that's true. I think it's fairly obviously true. But in the society, more generally speaking, I don't know. I mean, I think American society is still a fairly repressed society in many regards. We still obviously have censorship to some extent in movies and televisions. You can't curse on TV and things like that, which I think are pretty, absurd and very much outdated. Americans generally have much less free time, much less, vacation time than workers do in most other countries, which I think is an important aspect as well. Even things like, like hairstyles. Hairstyle is an interesting, indicator of sort of the dominant culture, right? And in the 60s and 70s, people were, generally sort of growing their hair out, which was, definitely an indication of a kind of countercultural thing. And again, this is even used as an example, when people talk about, the conservatism of the working class. At least one political commentator I remember listening to a while ago kind of made that point. It's like, what are you talking about that the workers are so, conservative in this country? I mean, most of the workers, at least, the younger ones in the 60s and 70s were sort of, they're growing their hair out and smoking marijuana and things like that. And sort of, embracing those aspects of the so-called counterculture. So this sort of longstanding belief that people have that working class people are, like inherently conservative or something. I mean, what is that actually being based upon? I mean, I know it's true to a certain extent. I mean, I know, relatives and family members who were, working class people who were very conservative. So I know there's some truth to it, but I think maybe that argument is often exaggerated. On the other hand, again, especially since the 1980s, people have kind of gone back, especially with like men's hairstyles. Most men keep their hair short, including myself. I'm as guilty of it as anybody else. In my case, though, it's definitely, because I, believe me, don't look good with longer hair. But a lot of other guys, or most other guys do that, and I think that is an interesting indication how we sort of gone back to a more sort of conservative culture in that regard. It's almost, if you look at most guys today, it's like it literally looks like they just got out of the army or something like that, even though of course most of them didn't. And the sort of long hair, short hair thing is an important, like I said, kind of cultural indicator. Just a couple other somewhat, random observations on this. I remember hearing a story about Mitt Romney and his, buddies, his, sadistic friends sort of, ganging up on a guy who had long hair and basically forcibly shaving his head, which obviously is a humiliating and, emasculating thing. And of course, Romney is a conservative, and it probably, him and his, psychotic friends, it probably, bothered him to see this guy with the long hair. Well, apparently also there was a definite sort of homophobic aspect to it as well, as the man was, the victim of this was either a homosexual or, perceived as being effeminate in some ways or something like that, which, again, kind of shows you that Romney is more than just some, stuffy old guy, but, probably deep down a sadistic bully as well. And I've heard of things like that happening. I mean, especially for conservative men back then that decide, it really bothered them seeing other men having long hair and stuff. What else can I say about that? Well, another thing, on a somewhat related note, I know Chris Rock one time made, the comedian made a documentary about hair, about Black women's hair, and the sort of the crazy lengths that many women go to sort of make their hair, look quote unquote more white, to sort of internalize those kind of this idea of internalizing whiteness is an important aspect of sociology and things like that. Basically, from the, I guess at least from the 1960s onward, and something which many Black people face in this country, that the sort of white culture that they many people do end up sort of internalizing to some extent, and hair being one aspect of that. I felt like there's something else I want to say about it, but about hair, but I can't think of it right now. But anyway, I mean, I wonder if that's one indication that you could point to that society has kind of become more conservative in that way. The people don't grow their hair out as much anymore, which used to be sort of seen as kind of a counterculture thing. I don't know. So yeah, I mean, I still think that, in many ways, I think both tendencies kind of coexist, right? And on one hand, of course, American society has become a little more open, allows a little more gratification of instinctual impulses, both of the sexual and the aggressive kind. But, in a way to foster social conformity as well. But the more repressive aspects of culture, I think, still very much live on to a large extent today, and certainly more concentrated in certain areas than others. But I think even more generally speaking, you do kind of see this more spread out throughout society as a whole, especially in comparison to other cultures, which do seem to be even more sort of opened to certain things than American society is. All right, so let's get into the the Freudian theory itself, because I think, again, that's one of the big aspects of reading this text, is that it does give you, I think, a pretty good overview of Freudian theory, which is very important in critical theory, something which we haven't talked very much about. So, again, I think Marcuse does give you kind of a good overview of that. So Freud, I don't know how familiar people are with Freud, if they've read a lot of Freud. I certainly read a lot of him in college and grad school. Not so much after that. I mean, I've definitely probably read more Marx at this point than I have Freud, but certainly in school, Freud was definitely a person that would turn up a lot, and of course is an important thinker. So Freud, if you don't know, was a very conservative thinker in his own right. Oftentimes he's compared to political philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, for example. And again, not assuming that everyone has read Hobbes, but Hobbes was a political philosopher who tended to favor a very sort of powerful government that could control people. Hobbes thought that people really needed to be controlled very tightly in order to prevent them from becoming violent and destructive, and basically to preserve order. Freud very much is sort of mirrors that aspect in many ways, which he believes again, that people need to be repressed, or well to just read the quote here from Marcuse, again, his sort of summary of Freud. Free gratification of man's instinctual needs is incompatible with civilized society. Renunciation and delay in satisfaction are the prerequisites of progress. And again, I believe that is a correct reading of Freud. Freud did believe that, again, civilization depends upon a very strong level of repression of impulses and instincts, that, again, people need to be controlled essentially in order to have civilization, have progress in society, for lack of a better term. But of course, he's talking about this, not necessarily on the political level, but on the individual level. That people need to sort of, repress their own sort of, psychic, drives and instincts and things like that. But presumably, then Freud would favor a kind of, political order, which would sort of, reinforce this kind of repression as well. Happiness, said Freud, is no cultural value. Happiness must be subordinated to the discipline of work as full-time occupation, to the discipline of monogamic reproduction, to the established system of law and order. The methodical sacrifice of libido, its rigidly enforced deflection to socially useful activities and expressions, is culture. Yeah, so that's basically Freud in a nutshell. And this idea of, working, being a productive employee, delayed gratification, delayed satisfaction, repressing, many aspects of what you would want to do. Freud would simply argue that these are necessary things of society, and that, society simply can't do without them. Now, Freud also realizes, of course, that people's, inner instinctual needs will constantly be sort of rebelling against that. But that also, serves as the argument for even greater control, because people are constantly sort of trying to sort of shrug off this kind of authority and repression, that you need even stronger authority and repression to basically, make sure that it sticks. And this, this idea of monogamic reproduction. So of course, we're talking about monogamous relationships, marriage. We're talking about, again, sexual activity only for the sake of procreation. So we're talking about, obviously this excludes, non-heterosexual relationships, even sexual relationships, again, that are not, purely for the purposes of producing children. And that was something that was heavily, very rigidly enforced. We're not going to talk too much about society, generally speaking, unless it comes up in the text. But for the most part, like I said, I think this book really works as kind of a document of sort of, 1950s America. And obviously those things were very much enforced back then. As somebody said, in another political show I was watching recently, homophobia was so sort of deeply ingrained within American culture that most people never even thought about it. Most people weren't even sort of conscious of being homophobic or being, anti-gay, because it just simply wasn't something that was talked about. Gay people or, queer people, or, whatever, LGBT people were simply invisible within sort of, mainstream American society. And that certainly outlived the 1950s as well. I mean, that was probably right up until the 1980s is when you begin to is when most people even begin to be conscious of heterosexual relationships. And only at that point do you then have homophobia becoming more of sort of a conscious force, people being more explicitly and consciously anti-gay or anti-homosexual. Whereas they were kind of always like that, but because those views were never even challenged, that it wasn't something people were even really that conscious of or explicit about. But then in the 80s and 90s, you have very explicit, homophobia. Gay bashing becomes a thing. Certainly in the 1990s, several incidents of, gay men especially being, attacked, beaten, sometimes killed by, other homophobic men. I mean, it was I'm not gonna say it happened every day, but I mean, it happened. It was a news. I mean, there's a man named Matthew Shepard, for example. I remember that was a big story in the 1990s, who was beaten to death basically by two homophobic men. That was a big story, and other instances like that. And some things more small scale. Sometimes things you would personally witness. Homophobic, bullying and things like that of people. You would see it in school, you would see it in the workplace, for example, and things like that. It was very, very common. And I don't think people maybe appreciate like how recently it has become where, non-heterosexual relationships have become much more sort of mainstream, much more normalized in American society. I mean, we're talking basically since like the 2010s is when it become acceptable. I mean, people, again, I think overlook or forget the fact that, somebody like Barack Obama, couldn't even come out in support of gay marriage or same-sex marriage until his second term in office. I mean, that's how recent it was. And certainly throughout the first, decade of the 20th century, I mean, that homophobia is very much on full display as well. And again, none of the prominent Democratic politicians of that day, whether it was the Clintons or Obama, were really willing to take a stand and sort of put themselves out there to support these issues until it became kind of safe to do, until society as a whole had kind of moved ahead on these issues. Now, of course, that's not to say that these things didn't exist at all, obviously, before the 1950s. They did. Let me briefly show a quick video about that, which I kind of want to show for a couple of weeks now, but I haven't got a chance, about the actress Marlene Dietrich, who's kind of an interesting person. That she was a German actress from the 1930s who made movies in Germany, then left Germany when the Nazis took power, came to the United States, became an actress here. Probably not as well known today, and it's kind of a shame. Was supposedly begged by the Nazis, supposedly by Goebbels himself, who was the minister of propaganda, to do Nazi propaganda films, but refused, obviously, and left Germany. Unlike somebody like Leni Riefenstahl, who, for example, somebody mentioned her film Triumph of the Will when I was grading the midterm exams. Totally different reaction there. She was also a German actress who later became a film director, and then I think later a photographer after the war. Marlene Dietrich left Germany, came to the United States, made a series of fairly interesting films in the United States in the early 1930s with a director named Joseph von Sternberg, who was also a director of hers in Germany. They made one very famous German movie called The Blue Angel, which is about this sort of cabaret singer who seduces this academic guy and leads him down the path of destruction and stuff. Kind of a cautionary tale, actually. So maybe not that progressive in its worldview. It's an okay movie. I've seen it on more than one occasion. But then they come to Hollywood in the 1930s, make a series of interesting films, one of which I'll show a brief clip from, called Morocco, which is kind of an interesting film. Anyway, Marlene Dietrich, in her personal life, again, we're talking like 1930s here, apparently lived a fairly openly bisexual lifestyle, which of course was not publicized very, very highly. The general public was probably unaware of it. Certainly wasn't portrayed in her movies, with some exceptions, which we'll see. But sort of lived that kind of, and sort of challenged, traditional gender stereotypes and things like that. Excuse me. Something. What else I want to say? Well, all right. Let me just play the clip itself because it's fairly short. Okay. So I'm switching screens. It is subtitled because there's a guy speaking maybe French or something. But it's a fairly short clip. Oh, it's not even 2 minutes long.
Certain movie queens of the day were the role models. Marlene Dietrich, Katharine Hepburn, Betty Davis. They often wore mannish clothes with no loss of feminine appeal.
Dans ces années 30, il y a une figure emblématique qui a porté des pantalons, c'est bien sûr Marlene Dietrich. Déjà, elle apparaît à l'écran dans le célèbre film Cœur brûlé en 1930, où elle porte un véritable smoking d'homme avec un chapeau haut de forme. Lorsque tout est fini, quand demeure votre beau rêve, pourquoi pleurer les jours sans puis regretter les temps partis? May I have this? Of course. Marlene Dietrich, à la fois dans la scène comme dans la vie, a porté des vêtements d'homme, cette image très belle et on peut comprendre provocante lorsqu'elle est arrivée à la gare Saint-Lazare à Paris en 1933 avec un véritable costume d'homme, avec un béret sur la tête et qui a fait sensation dans la presse parisienne à cette époque. Et d'ailleurs, c'est aussi à ce moment-là qu'un soir, elle a été refusée d'accès dans un restaurant parisien parce qu'elle portait un pantalon. Quel péché n'avaient pas commis les femmes en portant le pantalon? Il faudra attendre encore un peu avant qu'il ne soit accepté par tous.
This is the world's first reusable cotton.
Oh boy. All right. So yeah, I mean, people were somewhat challenging, those norms even back then. I think people kind of have this impression that, like, every aspect of American society was this way, and it certainly was the kind of mainstream culture, but it didn't mean that there was kind of, people more on the margins, hence the term marginalized, but people on the margins, sort of challenging these values even back then. And of course, it would take a very long time. Nowadays, seeing a woman wearing men's clothing wouldn't be particularly shocking, but back then it was. Now that the scenes the scene from the movie where she's wearing the tuxedo and kisses the woman is from a movie called Morocco, which was directed by Sternberg. I've seen it once, or maybe once or twice. It's very, it's kind of annoying because it's very hard to watch these movies today. I mean, she made a series of movies, at least maybe 4, I think, with Sternberg, all of which are pretty interesting. I can't remember the names of all of them, but there was Morocco. There's another one called Shanghai Express or something like that. Another one called The Scarlet Empress, which is very, bizarre, about Catherine the Great, the future czar of Russia, or Tsarina of Russia. And another one whose name I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But they're all fairly interesting movies, all made in the early 1930s. So if there are any film nerds out there, you would know the idea of, what they called back then basically pre-code films, right? There were a series of movies made in the early 1930s, which were made before the establishment of what is often referred to as the Hays Code. And it's basically censorship. It was a code of censorship for movies that basically took effect in the middle of the 30s and basically lasted until the introduction of the modern day rating system, which was introduced in the late 1960s, supposedly in response to movies like Night of the Living Dead and I think Bonnie and Clyde, which is a fairly violent movie for that period of time. But over 30 years or so, you have this very explicit code of censorship, and of course, it prohibited things like that. No, you would not see, really women kissing each other and things like that, or anything other than, straight, heterosexual conduct. It extended into things like, crime dramas and things like that. The cops and politicians couldn't be portrayed as being, corrupt or anything like that, even though, of course, they obviously were back then, some of them. So it was a very sort of, explicit, very, rigid code of censorship that was explored. But, if you happen to see some of these earlier movies from the 30s before the code was introduced, by today's standards, again, they're still fairly tame, but by the standards of later, black and white movies and things like that, you do see them pushing the boundaries a little bit with scenes like that. Again, it was a very brief period of time. Anyway, though, and I'm not suggesting it's a case of censorship, today, because these things will be fairly tame by today's standards. But it's very hard to find these movies. These are old Marlene Dietrich movies. They're not available on iTunes. They're not available on Netflix. They're not available on any of the streaming services I'm aware of. They're not available on HBO Max, which also owns Turner Classic Movies, which we would think would be the logical place to to find these movies. They're not available anywhere. I think when I saw Morocco, I think it was on one of those sort of like bootleg streaming services like Vimeo or like Daily Motion or something like that. I think it was then later taken down from there. So it's very hard to find these movies. I'm sure you could probably find it in libraries and things like that, but they're not readily available on a lot of other modern streaming services, which most people would use, including things like iTunes. And other things are, you can find Greta Garbo movies, for example, who's, another actress I mentioned from back then. You can find, Orson Welles movies. You can find, a lot of older classic movies, but for whatever reason, you can't find these. Anyway, I just thought it was kind of interesting. It does kind of go against the sort of dominant idea that people have where like everybody was repressed back then. And yeah, probably a lot of people were, but there were people who were kind of challenging things a little bit. And, by the way, the narrator mentions other actresses, Katharine Hepburn, Betty Davis was another one. So, kind of an interesting period of time, especially this so-called pre-code era of Hollywood filmmaking. what else can I say about Marlene Dietrich? Not much. I mean, she, like I said, lived a fairly openly bisexual lifestyle. Apparently, had many lovers during her lifetime. Is a quite sexually voracious person. Apparently, slept with JFK, which I guess did JFK sleep with every actress in Hollywood? It seems like it sometimes, and pretty much everyone else as well. But so kind of an interesting person. Unfortunately, she's not as remembered today. But anyway, back to Freud. So, well, this is actually Marcuse talking about Freud, but he goes on to say, however, intensified progress seems to be bound up with intensified unfreedom. So here again, we get this sort of dialectical view of things, right? This idea that progress, which is supposed to create more freedom, is actually creating unfreedom, as he calls it. Throughout the world of industrial civilization, the domination of man by man is growing in scope and efficiency. Again, very much reminiscent of the argument of dialectic of enlightenment. Nor does this trend appear as an incidental, transitory regression on the road to progress. Again, this is him talking in the 1950s. Concentration camps, mass exterminations, world wars, and atom bombs are no relapse into barbarism, but the unrepressed implementation of the achievements of modern science, technology, and domination. In Freudian terms, all right, so this is a very important concept in Freudian theory, right? This idea of the pleasure principle. In Freudian terms, is the conflict between pleasure principle and reality principle irreconcilable to such a degree that it necessitates the repressive transformation of man's instinctual structure, or does it allow the concept of a non-repressive civilization based on a fundamentally different experience of being, a fundamentally different relation between man and nature, and fundamentally different existential relations? So this idea of pleasure principle and reality principle are very important concepts in Freudian thought. So basically, what Freud argues the pleasure principle is, I mean, it's basically what it says is that human psychology is sort of geared towards maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain. And Freud would argue that left to their own devices, basically that's all people would basically do. They would just pleasure themselves constantly and never do anything else. So because that is incompatible with the development of civilization, the people gradually learn, and in many cases is forced upon them, to repress some aspects of this, right? And what he calls the sort of repression of the pleasure principle, or this adaptation or modification of the pleasure principle, becomes the reality principle, becomes this idea that we still pursue pleasure, we still act out of self-interested ways, but we sort of modify ourselves to sort of, adapt to and in many ways, conform to the needs of society and sort of the dominant values of society. And there are various ways in which this enforcement is enforced upon people, largely through, what we'd call the carrot and the stick, basically. People that conform are rewarded, people that, disobey are punished in various ways, whether it's monetary success, social status, more direct forms of punishment, and things like that. These are all ways in which we basically, modify the pleasure principle into the reality principle. So Marcuse talks a little bit about what he calls the neo-Freudians. And this would basically be sort of mainstream psychiatry. So as we'll get into this, there are many aspects of Freud's theory which are even controversial for many psychiatrists, especially this idea of the life instincts and the death instincts, which we'll get into a little bit more. But most sort of modern, and even the whole idea of the unconscious to some extent, at least. Most modern day psychiatry tends to deal with the sort of conscious aspects of life, deals with the ego more so than with the id. And even sort of updating this argument a little bit more, from when Marcuse is talking about this, many people have said that, modern day psychiatry now has essentially become pharmacology. It's essentially become prescribing drugs. And that basically makes up, the bulk of psychiatric care, so-called care for people. Whereas, anyone that knows about Freud or knows a little bit about psychiatry as it existed back then, sort of the, the stereotypical example, right, is this, person speaking on a couch, to an analyst. The analyst is mostly silent and just sort of more or less recording or taking notes on what the person is saying. That's kind of the traditional, image or view that people have of psychiatry. That model, and Freud himself popularized that model, right? Popularized the idea of the so-called talking cure, the idea that just sort of talking about things and sort of working out, sort of getting to these sort of unconscious, memories and impulses and things like that could cure people of certain forms of neurotic behavior. Not everything, but certain aspects of it. This is what Freud, believed, at least. That has, for the most part, been replaced now by basically just prescribing meds to people. And I think that's the, experience that many people have, if they've had any, interactions with a psychiatrist in a modern day setting. They still kind of go through the motions a little bit, which seems almost like a throwback or a holdover of talking to people, but it seems very much a formality. It's very brief. And for the most part, it just serves as a pretext to just, writing out a prescription for something. And of course, then this goes into the whole aspect of, pharmaceutical drugs and the profitability of the pharmaceutical industry, which is massively profitable. Are these drugs being overprescribed to people? Probably. I'm not an expert on this topic, but I think there are a lot of people that have sort of, with more expertise than I have that have weighed in on this and make a pretty good case that these drugs are being overprescribed. Whether, I'm not just talking about painkillers either, which is an important aspect of it, but antidepressants, anxiety medication, things like that as well, things to treat ADHD and all that stuff. So that's kind of the way, the direction that modern day psychiatry has taken. Anyway, so Marcuse is not exactly thrilled with psychiatry in his day as well, which again sort of precedes this era. But what he says about what he calls the neo-Freudians, which again are basically mainstream psychiatry. He says, in shifting the emphasis from the unconscious to the conscious, from the biological to the cultural factors, they cut off the roots of society in the instincts and instead take society at the level on which it confronts the individual as his ready-made environment without questioning its origin and legitimacy. Consequently, the neo-Freudian critique remains in a strict sense ideological. It has no conceptual basis outside the established system. Most of its critical ideas and values are those provided by the system. So I see a comment. I'll read that in a second. But basically, what he's saying, and I think this is also true, is that mainstream psychiatry tends to individualize everything. There's no longer social forces or social factors which essentially drive people to certain, if not violent behavior, certainly to neurotic forms of behavior, certain forms of mental illness and things like that. Everything just becomes a function of your own sort of, biology, basically. Which I think is a false view to be putting on people, and is a view that definitely works to the benefit of the system. So you no longer have to question a society which, again, alienates people and dehumanizes people and things like that. People that develop certain, pathological forms of behavior, it simply becomes a question of their own sort of failure or inability to sort of adapt to the environment, which again is sort of, as he says, sort of taken for granted, just that sort of exists. And this would also be an example of reification, by the way, as well. This idea that we confront society as this sort of, immovable presence, that it's just this construct that exists that we have no connection to and certainly can't do anything to change. So I think those are very important views. I think those are still views which sort of, are behind, most of modern day psychiatry as well. This could all be sort of, summed up by the phrase, I'm sorry you feel that way, which of course people, love to say in many different, in many different regards. If you have a certain negative reaction to something, it's purely your own choice and your own, it's all on you, basically. The idea that, again, people could sort of be driven to certain extremes of behavior just simply does not, factor into this at all. So Alexandra says, in the sociology of mental illness, we talk a lot about the anti-psychiatry movements and how certain aspects of deinstitutionalization led to the over-prescribing by psychiatrists. Yeah, the anti-psychiatry movement is an interesting movement, which I think sort of comes out around this period of time, maybe from the 1950s, maybe a little bit later. And yeah, I mean, yes, I think it's a very sort of common theme now, this idea that people are being over prescribed medications. And again, and it also sort of, breaks people away from this sort of, social environment that they live in. That again, a lot of, mental illness is sort of, driven by this alienation, dehumanization. Again, the fact that people are, reduced to objects basically and treated as such, treated as if they are, less than human. That of course that's going to, lead to all sorts of, negative reactions on the part of people. But all this is sort of overlooked by, mainstream psychiatry. Excuse me. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say about that. Sometimes I feel like there's something lingering in my own unconscious, but I can't seem to think of it right now. All right, so let me just move on. Yeah, well, again, just to reemphasize, yes, I would say that's pretty much true, that psychiatry is, again, in a large sense, very much ideological as well. That is basically a way of supporting the system, basically. All right, so back to this idea of the reality principle, right? But the reality which shapes the instincts as well as their needs and satisfaction is a socio-historical world. The animal man becomes a human being only through a fundamental transformation of his nature, affecting not only the instinctual aims, but also the instinctual values. That is, the principles that govern the attainment of the aims. So what Marcuse is saying here is that, Freud himself was actually better than a lot of the so-called neo-Freudians which came at him. And that Freud himself did at least understand the importance of social psychology. The people, of course, were, of course, in a very important way, shaped by their social environment as well. They couldn't just individualize everything. And that, and to the extent to which, it's sort of gone down that path, sort of represents a lowering of, standards, or that thinkers after Freud were not as sort of advanced as he was in this area. With the establishment of the reality principle, the human being, which under the pleasure principle has been hardly more than a bundle of animal drives, has become an organized ego. It strives for what is useful and what can be obtained without damage to itself and to its vital environment. Under the reality principle, the human being develops the function of reason. It learns to test the reality, to distinguish between good and bad, true and false, useful and harmful. So this idea of testing reality becomes, again, an important way in which the pleasure principle is modified into the reality principle. And again, this is basically a summation of Freud. So this is your summary of Freud if you've never read Freud, before. And again, this idea of testing reality kind of goes back to, I said, a moment ago about, the carrot and the stick. Good behavior is rewarded, bad behavior is punished. People will talk about, the child example, a child learns, the distinction between hot and cold when they touch a stove. I think I've heard even examples of parents doing that on purpose to teach, it seems pretty extreme. I think, you don't have to do that to teach a child to learn the difference between hot and cold, but I guess that's the way they were brought up. And of course, some people have to, raise their kids exactly the same way. But again, this idea of testing reality, important part of it. Only one mode of thought activity is split off from the new organization of the mental apparatus and remains free from the rule of the reality principle. Fantasy, spelled with a PH instead of an F. Remember several weeks ago, I talked about the game, Final Fantasy, for example. Fantasy is protected from cultural alterations and stays committed to the pleasure principle Otherwise, the mental apparatus is effectively subordinated to the reality principle. So what he's saying here, and again, this is Marcuse's summation of Freud, is that fantasy then becomes the sort of the one realm of mental and cultural life, basically, where people can sort of allow for the pleasure principle to sort of work itself out uninhibited, more or less. And again, it's sort of, with a clear distinction made, of course, it's sort of, separated from reality, right? That it's not a part of reality. It's sort of confined to this one sort of, limited, mode of activity. But within this sort of limited mode, people are more or less given sort of, free reign to fantasize, basically, which doesn't, necessarily mean fantasies of a sexual nature as well, but anything like that, Fantasy also means, again, fantasy literature and things like that, the Lord of the Rings and all that other stuff that comes out of that as well. It's interesting though to think, to some extent, where even the realm of fantasy begins to be sort of colonized, or that the dominant values of society even sort of work themselves into fantasy and the literature of fantasy and things like that, where sort of dominant values are sort of expressed even in that realm as well. He talks about phylogenesis and ontogenesis. So what these terms basically mean is that we're basically looking at sort of two different scales. One, the development of society as a whole and the gradual sort of evolution of society. And the second, basically the sort of mental evolution of the child into adulthood. So as he says, phylogenetically, it occurs first in the primal horde, sort of this sort of primal, tribe of people, which may or may not have ever actually existed. When the primal father monopolizes power and pleasure and enforces renunciation on the part of the sons. Anyone who's heard of Freud, of course, knows about, his famous idea of the Oedipal complex. And this is kind of where this idea comes from. And Freud did argue that there is a kind of, historical basis for this, that you see the son sort of rebel against the father and kill the father, largely out of sexual jealousy over their mother. Or as it says here, the father monopolizes power and pleasure, basically monopolizes all the women. We're not even talking about a monogamous relationship here. And the sons basically rebel, kill the father, then feel guilty about killing the father, and then sort of resurrect the father, not literally, but in the sense of religion, God often, being portrayed as kind of a paternal father figure, not always, but in many cases. And sort of resurrecting the father through the dominant values of society, which people then sort of internalize and live according to. That's the one aspect of it. The other, the ontogenetic process occurs during the during the period of early childhood, and submission to the reality principle is enforced by the parents and other educators. So, here, cue the Pink Floyd music, Another Brick in the Wall. I mean, and to a large extent, that's what schools do, right? Schools are meant to, particularly at a young age, sort of, teach children how to act and, how to, internalize the dominant values of society. Parents play a role, schools play a role, other institutions, other cultural institutions, or churches, obviously, would be another example. All play a role in that as well. But again, as mentioned, Freud also realizes that there's this constant sort of tension and the desire to kind of shrug off the psychic repression that individuals go through, and is sort of maintained by society as well. So he calls this the return of the repressed. The return of the repressed impulses, which are sort of always there, again, and this is where the unconscious comes into play, right? These impulses that are repressed never fully go away, but they sort of enter into the level of the unconscious, and perhaps even create the unconscious. I think that's kind of the argument here, is that the unconscious is essentially created by this constant need to repress impulses and urges. And it's always there, and periodically these unconscious urges sort of bubble up to the surface, as it were. Turned back by the external reality or even unable to reach it, the full force of the pleasure principle not only survives in the unconscious, but also affects in manifold ways the very reality which has superseded the pleasure principle. The return of the repressed makes up the tabooed and subterranean history of civilization. And the exploitation of this history reveals not only the secret of the individual, but also that of civilization. Again, one of Freud's most well-known works from his later period is known as Totem and Taboo. And it's actually in this work where he, sorry, I have to plug in my laptop. My battery goes dead. Totem and Taboo, where he basically sort of, talks about this idea of, the primal horde and the primal father and things like that. And it's not quite clear if Freud actually literally thinks that this happened historically. I think he does. I mean, I think maybe some people debate that point. From what I can tell, I think this is how Freud sees humanity at its very sort of earliest, stages, where we're in sort of, tribes of nomadic hunters and, like things like that, that at some point this kind of plays itself out in society. And then, everything else happens after that, the establishment of religion and the eventual development of more settled societies coming out of that, as well as with things like development of agriculture and stuff like that. It's a fairly complex process, but that's one aspect of it. So again, here's this term sublimation, which we talked about, right? So Marcuse picks up this idea in his work from the 1960s, what he calls repressive desublimation, which again means that we're not repressing instincts as much anymore, the sexual and the aggressive instincts, that we're allowing for a limited, key word here, limited gratification of those instincts, but only to the extent in which it sort of fosters, social control, basically. Society's motive in enforcing the decisive modification of the instinctual structure is thus economic, since it has not means enough to support life for its members without work on their part. It must see to it that the number of these members is restricted and their energies directed away from sexual activities onto their work. So the quotes are, Freud, right? So when I have this passage, this is from Marcuse's book, page 17. But when you see the text in quotes, that's usually Marcuse quoting Freud. So this is Freud himself talking about this. And again, this is basically the whole argument for repression. And this is what or the argument for why repression takes place. It's basically economic. And again, like I said, I think very much is an effective argument against the Christian right, who, argue for this kind of repressive morality for what they believe is some kind of moral purpose. But I think Freud shows quite clearly it's really just for economic. It's basically to make people more, productive employees, basically, which of course is not a moral purpose in its own right. And I think kind of shows you again the hollowness of that kind of morality. So this is something I took off of Google, but basically, sort of a chart of Freud's, sort of basic, notion of instincts or basic theory of instincts. Instincts, strong innate forces that provide all the energy in the psychic system. Freud's original theory of instincts was influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. In the initial formulation, there were two instinct classes: self-preservation instincts and sexual instincts. So originally, and Freud changes this idea, but originally the idea was that we are guided basically by two powerful instinctual forces: sexual, or basically the need for pleasure, and self-preservation, the need to stay alive. And that these instincts oftentimes come into conflict with each other, as is already sort of, elaborated in this idea of the, pleasure principle becoming the reality principle. If we only act on the basis of our pleasure, it would sort of, undermine our need for self-preservation, or at least that's what Freud thinks. And certainly at that period of time of, when societies are not really developed either. Because that's a big part of Marcuse's argument, right? Which I'm kind of, foreshadowing here a little bit. But basically, Marcuse, not to get too ahead of things. But he argues that, again, we have now reached a point where we don't need to repress ourselves as much anymore. And he seems to at least acknowledge the idea that, yes, maybe at a certain point, people did need to do this in order to develop. But now we've reached a high level of development, and there's just simply no need to repress ourselves that much anymore, that we've now reached a point where we can, so basically enjoy ourselves more. I mean, it's essentially what he's arguing for here. But anyway, so this theory, quickly becomes, or not quickly, but eventually becomes superseded by another theory of Freud, which becomes this idea of the life instinct, what he calls Eros, and the death instinct, Thanatos. Very similar, by the way, to the, Thanos, as you may know from those Marvel movies, which means death, basically. Now, some people have argued, I'll just mention this briefly because I guess it's not that important, but I was always taught that the idea of a death instinct was actually a kind of mistranslation of Freud, that it actually should be termed something like the death drive, and that death was not an instinct because instincts tend towards, life, basically. So the death drive was something more basic, more primal, basically, more, essentially underneath the life instincts. I mean, Freud, when you read him, talks about this idea of sort of, digging through almost like sort of like different layers of the mind, which is kind of an interesting, metaphor, and sort of like probing deeper and deeper and deeper, trying to get to the very bottom level of consciousness, which he finds to be this death drive, basically. Anyway, I guess it's just sort of a semantic point. It seems like most people now, take for granted or accept the idea that we have life instincts and death instincts. So I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, just to go back for a second. So in this sort of revised version of Freud's theory, the life instincts now encompass both. They both encompass self-preservation and the sexual instincts. Those are basically the so-called forces of life, as it says here. Instincts for sex, nurturance, affiliation. The death instincts represent instincts for aggression towards the self or aggression towards others. And it's not a question, so you might think, well, the goal then should be to, be on the side of the life instincts and repress the death instincts. It's not quite as simple as that, though, right? Again, in a very sort of dialectical way of looking at these things, both the life and death instincts are very much sort of bound up and intertwined with each other. And occasionally, at least, the death instincts can be used in a more productive way. I mean, anyone, especially if you're committed to changing things, right? If you want to change things, you have to destroy, you have to break down the previous structure so you can build up a new structure, right? In economic terms, the economist Joseph Schumpeter coined the term creative destruction that kind of speaks to that idea. The creativity, again, in order to create something new, you oftentimes have to destroy something old to create something new. So it's not just a question of being on one side or the other, or emphasizing one over the other. It's more about, again, realizing in a dialectical way how these instincts are sort of bound up with each other. That being said, what Marcuse's concern is that the life instincts have become so weakened in the name of repression that it's actually strengthening the death instinct, that the people are becoming actually more self-destructive and destructive towards other people as well. And that this repression of the life instinct, I don't know why my voice is going all of a sudden. Excuse me. Maybe I need some water. My allergies are bothering me. Sorry. But anyway, so that in order to preserve society, which again, the building of society is a function of the life instincts, but in order to preserve it, people are becoming so repressed again that the death instinct is beginning to sort of, take over. And again, I would say that, again, going back to the Christian right, and some of the comments that I made last class about climate change and things like that, it is kind of a scary idea to think that that you're dealing with basically a group of people whose death instincts have become so predominant, basically, that it's almost like they have an unconscious death wish or something like that. And that perhaps couldn't inform why they seem so stubbornly resistant to doing anything about climate change, even to the extent of even acknowledging that it exists. And of course, you see that, their warmongering ways, their fetishization of guns and firearms and things like that. There are various ways that you could, I think, point to show maybe this death instinct sort of manifesting itself. Again, kind of a scary idea, and even sort of undermines the idea of being a conservative, because so to be a conservative, to literally want to conserve things, means, of course, that you want to hold on to things, and what you may be dealing with, in fact, are a group of people who yearn for destruction. And Freud will kind of sort of elaborate what, what you might say, well, that seems far-fetched. Why would people yearn for that? But yeah, I think he actually has a pretty good explanation for that, which I'll get to in a moment, presuming I have time. Yeah, I still have some time. So, well, yeah, all right, so let me just get to that then. So after World War I, and I think it's also interesting that Freud sort of modifies his theory towards life instincts and death instincts after the First World War, which of course was a massive, orgy of death, basically. Beginning in the 1920s, when he writes a book called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which again, but its title is a fairly, catchy title, right? So we've always thought that, pleasure is the most basic thing, right? The people are just these sort of, self-interested, pleasure calculating robots, basically, that are just programmed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But now Freud starts to get to a point where he says, well, no, there's actually something beyond that, as he says. And so he says, oh, it's I don't have the page number there. That's an oversight on my part. I'm sorry. He says, it seems then that an instinct is an urge inherent in organic life to restore to an earlier state of things, which the living entity has been obliged to abandon under the pressure of external disturbing forces. That is, it is a kind of organic elasticity, or to put it another way, the expression of the inertia inherent in organic life. So again, this is on page 29. He says, or Marcuse says, the death instinct is destructiveness not for its own sake, but for the relief of tension. The descent toward death is an unconscious flight from pain and want. It is an expression of the eternal struggle against suffering and repression. And the death instinct itself seems to be affected by the historical changes which affect this struggle. So this is essentially Freud's argument for the death instinct. That's essentially like it's essentially an escape from pain, basically. So what he's saying is that for certain people, when pain and frustration become such a predominant aspect of their lives, that they start to yearn for death, that they start to yearn for a release from that pain, which can only be brought by death, basically. I mean, it's a pretty sad, commentary on things, but there probably are people, unfortunately, that have to deal with that. And again, going back to, and in a more sort of critical view, maybe less sympathetic sounding, but if we apply this then to the religious right, these uber repressed people, what the argument would be saying here, or how the argument what would go, is that essentially these people are so miserable, basically, that they're so incapable of experiencing joy in their own lives, that they start to yearn for death, and they start to yearn for destruction, not only of themselves, but for other people as well, that they want to sort of, inflict their own kind of miserable lives, basically, on other people. And if they can't, then they basically just want to destroy them. And that is, again, that's a scary thought to have to come to grips with. And I say that because I happen to think it's probably true. At least that's sort of, how I view the religious right in this country. They're like a death cult, basically. And again, I mentioned last class too, if you listen to or read a lot of these really, out there Christian people, I mean, they yearn for like the end of the world. They want to see the world end. They're praying for the day when, they get called up to heaven and, sit next to Jesus on a cloud, or, whatever it is they believe. And that underlies their support for Israel, that supports, a lot of their, views of the world. But again, as an explanation for why this death instinct might exist, I think it makes sense. I mean, a lot of people could, consider this to be a controversial idea of Freudian theory. Again, like I said, a lot of modern day or mainstream psychiatrists don't even accept this idea, and they sort of go back to the earlier version of Freud, where it's just a sort of conflict between pleasure and self-preservation, basically. And they, in fact, reject this idea of the death instinct, that people have an instinct towards death. I don't know. I mean, I'm curious to see what, hear what other people think about it. I don't think it's that far-fetched. I mean, it seems to make sense to me that, again, for certain people that they're, the pain of existence becomes so great for them that they start to yearn for death. And obviously then the solution for that would be to make life more pleasant and enjoyable for people. And then they wouldn't, yearn for death so much, yearn for the sweet release of death. Does that seem that far-fetched? I mean, I don't think so. Okay. So this is often a metaphor used to describe, Freud's, because the next thing then he sort of, moves into is talking about the id, the ego, the superego. Again, I'm assuming if anyone has any familiarity with Freud at all, that they've heard this idea before. It's often, compared to an iceberg, the idea that the sort of visible part of the iceberg, just like the conscious part of our minds, is only just the surface of things and a very small part of it, that actually greater part of our minds is actually unconscious. And it's kind of an interesting idea, right? It suggests that there's these sort of vast depths to the human psyche, most of which are completely unknown to us. It's just this sort of hidden, mysterious aspect of our own minds and of our own selves. That the vast, that the most of the so-called structure, and Freud does call it a, sort of a structural model, is sort of more or less hidden from surface. And then of course you have to explain a little bit the id, ego, and superego. Do I explain that in the next quote? I don't know. I forget now. No. So real quick, so the idea of the id, of course, is this idea, this is where the pleasure principle is. This is the, the part of us that just wants to gratify our impulses, whether it's the life instincts, whether it's the death instincts. And then this is sort of the most sort of unconscious part of the mind. The ego then becomes the part of our mind which sort of mediates, as Freud explains, sort of mediates or, deals with the reality, the external reality that we live in, the external environment that we live in, while trying to satisfy as much of it can, at least basically, of the needs created, from the id, or the needs that are sort of generated by the id. So the ego is sort of the go between the two. The superego then refers to sort of the larger sort of, cultural values of society, which we begin to internalize. Like I mentioned before about the Chris Rock Hair documentary, or this idea that the Black people are oftentimes, forced to sort of internalize whiteness. That's sort of the superego, right? The dominant values of society. And all people do that, not just white and Black people, obviously, or not just Black people living in America, but all people do. We all sort of internalize to some extent the dominant values of society, oftentimes in an unconscious way. That's why, again, as the model shows here, most of the superego, not all of it, but most of it is also unconscious. And we don't even realize to a large extent how much or to what extent we've sort of internalized these values. Mostly because I think a lot of this process occurs at a very young age, right? This is what we're taught, again, by parents and by teachers and by other sort of, authoritative figures, that we're taught at a very early age to internalize these values. So we go through our entire lives sort of acting on the basis of these things without ever really questioning it or examining it or anything like that. So that's more or less the basic idea of how that works. And again, up until now, this has mostly just been a summary of Freud. So now Marcuse starts to get into some of his own concepts, some of his own contributions to this. One is what he terms to be surplus repression. So again, what he means by this, surplus means basically like extra, excuse me, is that we're more repressed than we need to be, basically. So Marcuse accepts the idea that yes, a certain amount of repression is probably necessary for the development of society and even for the continued maintenance of society. That it's not necessarily a bad thing to sublimate yourself, to repress some instinctual energies or impulses for the, for the higher goods. Again, all artistic creative works is basically a product of sublimation. I mean, Marcuse, I'm sure, is aware of the fact that he would not be able to write a book like this if he did not sublimate himself, at least to a certain extent. So some amount of repression, he's saying, is necessary. But what he's saying is that basically in the society that we live in, again, basically 1950s America, but I think still to some extent, even in the present day, is that we're forced to repress ourselves more than we have to. There's simply an excess of repression that goes far beyond what is necessary for the continued maintenance and development of society. Excuse me. So as he says here, the restrictions necessitated by social domination. This is distinguished from basic repression, the modifications of the instincts necessary for the perpetuation of the human race in civilization. Domination differs from rational exercise of authority. The latter, which is inherent in any societal division of labor, is derived from knowledge and confined to the administration of functions and arrangements necessary for the advancement of the whole. In contrast, domination is exercised by a particular group or individual in order to sustain and enhance itself in a privileged position. He goes on, he says, this argument, which looms large in Freud's metapsychology, is fallacious insofar as it applies to the brute fact of scarcity, which is actually the consequence of a specific organization of scarcity and of a specific existential attitude enforced by this organization. So what he's saying, he's now critiquing Freud's view that we have to repress ourselves to a very large extent. Again, Freud being fairly conservative in his outlook on things. He's saying that no, the Freud is wrong here. The Freud is, generalizing what may have existed during his time, late 19th century, early 20th century. I think Freud dies in like 1940, actually. So he was he was actually around for a pretty long time. That level of repression was tied to the idea of scarcity, that there's not enough resources basically to go around for people, and people have to work really hard to gain access to them. Now, basically, he's saying, and I realize that we're running out of time here, so I'll just summarize it basically real quick, is that, no, look, we now live in a fairly advanced society. Scarcity doesn't really exist anymore. To the extent that it does exist, it's sort of artificially imposed upon people. This artificial imposition of scarcity, basically just to keep people, just to keep people working. The threat of poverty and illness and starvation is basically just used as a motivation, basically to force people to work. But it doesn't have to be that way. There's more than enough resources around to supply these basic needs of people. I mean, and I've said this before, there's, people don't go hungry in this country. Many people do go hungry, but people don't go hungry in this country because there's not enough food in this country. They go hungry because they don't have money for it. And in fact, the amount of, the tons of food that's wasted in this country every year is more than enough that could feed probably not even, people in this country, but probably throughout most, if not, the rest of the world. But all right, I guess we have to break here now. So I didn't really talk about the midterm. If you have any questions about it, we can meet and talk about it. Basically, I saw, most people did pretty well. I'll try to talk about more last class. I wanted to at the beginning of class, but there weren't that many people here. I'll also post essay guidelines next week, and I'll talk more about that. All right, I realize I have to let you go, so we'll just leave it there. But any questions about anything? If not, then, have a good week, everyone, and I'll see you next week. Is the final cumulative? Well, it's a final paper, but it basically counts for whatever it says on the syllabus, 30% of the grade, 35% of the grade, something like that. But I'll talk about that more next week, or, if you want to meet, we can meet and discuss it. All right, so take care, everyone. Have a good week.